Welcome to Mooney Reads, and welcome to a Queer History Month recommendations video. If you didn't see part one, you can go check that out. What I've been doing is that I am suggesting queer history books that I liked, but also pairing them with books that are on my physical TBR. In the first video, a lot of it was focused on history that is specific to a particular identity. I went over some lesbian history books, some trans history books, and a few other things. This video is, it has some stuff that's a little bit more focused on politics and a lot that's on the AIDS epidemic, which I think is a really crucial time period to understand, to see how we are here currently and the things that impacted the political landscape, and just how quickly things can ebb and flow in that regard. I could go on, but I should behave myself and get into the books. The first book that I have is Transgender Warriors by Leslie Feinberg. This goes over different parts of trans history in different places, particularly looking at how gender variant people have been integral to certain parts of society and how they have fought back kind of when necessary. So this is looking at particular groups and also particular people. It also goes over parts of Leslie Feinberg's own life, particularly gaining kind of class consciousness in a way. So this one was really excellent, along with like anything else that you can get your hands on that Leslie Feinberg has written. And I have paired that one with Against Equality, Queer Revolution, Not Mere Inclusion. This is an anthology, so there are a lot of different writers, and this is definitely more on the like political, social science end and less like overtly about history, although you very much get something from this historical moment. This was before marriage equality. This edition was published in 2004. So these authors are questioning kind of norms in place, the whole idea of marriage in the first place. But I thought it went well with Transgender Warriors because of the politics of the author, but also just because striving for liberation and going up against the kind of destructive powers that be is very much Transgender Warriors. So I thought it was a good pairing. And kind of continuing on, I've obviously got to have another Leslie Feinberg in here. This is Trans Liberation Beyond Pink or Blue, and this is a collection of speeches and essays, mostly, but not only, by Leslie, talking about the importance of solidarity, both within different facets of the trans community, but also between the trans community and other communities. The other essays are written by other members of the trans community, including Sylvia Rivera. So this is a really cool one, and I have paired it with Lavender and Red, Liberation and Solidarity in the Gay and Lesbian Left. I feel like I don't really need to explain how these two are related, but this one is kind of like a larger history, whereas this one is, like I said, more speeches and essays talking about the issue. This one is more relevant if you're looking for like literal kind of history. The next recommendations that I have are related to queer people and the prison system. So first I have Captive Genders, Trans Embodiment, and the Prison Industrial Complex. This is an anthology from people like academics talking about this, but also people who were or are incarcerated, and talks about the experiences of trans and gender nonconforming people in prison, and the terrible way that they're treated, both in the US and Canada. So there's a little bit about actual like policy in here, but even more about the experiences of folks and why abolition is such an important part of what we need to be focused on in terms of queer liberation. And another book that I would like to read on this topic is Queer Injustice, the criminalization of LGBT people in the United States. So I imagine that this is going to be talking about the history of policy, making gender nonconformity or homosexuality illegal at various points in time. And this looks like it also pulls from experiences of people who have been in the prison system as well. So I'm looking forward to that aspect of it. Then the next pairing that I have actually has to do with the history of drag. So I'm going to start off with The Big Reveal by Sasha Velour, which every time I talk about this and Transgender Warriors, I have to say that they are amazing paired together. That is how I read them, and I was totally obsessed. They talk about similar histories, so there's overlap, but also where the books, like where there isn't overlap, I think they do very well in informing each other. So obviously, Transgender Warriors is about trans people. The Big Reveal is about drag, but naturally there's a lot of overlap. As well as history, Sasha also talks about her own experiences with drag and gender, and that's also very interesting to read alongside Leslie's memoir, because these are both trans, they both do drag, and they're both Jewish. They're just from different generations, so that's really neat to read together. But Sasha also talks about art and theory, talking about drag and camp, and also mentions the politics of drag in this as well, because while there are people who did use it and continue to use it for different things politically, there's also there are people in more mainstream drag who have been, I wouldn't say apolitical, because I don't really buy that that exists anyways, but they're more in line with the mainstream, so kind of the implications of some of the mainstreaming of drag historically. So that one is really great. I love Sasha Velour. This also has really cool pictures and illustrations, so we love a mixed media moment. But I've paired this with, and the category is Inside New York's Vogue, House, and Ballroom Community. So this is looking at the history of drag, but very particularly the New York ball scene. And from here, we're going to be starting to talk a little bit more about books that center around or involve the AIDS epidemic. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is kind of the niche within the niche that I'm really interested in, but so like I have a whole TBR around it, which is why I have so many that I'm going to be talking about here, but also I think that it is very important. So if you don't know very much about this, if you're trying to figure out what part of history to read, I would really recommend looking into the 80s and 90s, into the AIDS epidemic. So I am going to start with Let the Record Show by Sarah Schulman. This is one that I have not technically finished reading, but I am over halfway done with. Plan to read the rest of the way soon. This is a history of ACT UP. This author put together a project to interview people from across ACT UP, and in this paints a picture of what it looked like, but not just kind of, I think, the mainstream picture that got painted of ACT UP, which is to say very white and cis gay focused, but there was a lot more that was happening. So she talks about a lot of the different groups that are in this, which is really wide reaching, because ACT UP, the model that they used, they were very focused on people like having their own different groups and different focuses, and then coming together to do certain actions and achieve certain things that these groups have come up with. So it's a coalition in that way. So you definitely do get the story of the white cis gay men who are in this, but she also has a big focus on, for instance, there's a chapter on Puerto Ricans who were in ACT UP. There's a chapter that focuses on drug users who were in ACT UP and the importance of the needle exchange programs, the women who were in ACT UP. There's a lot here. If you've seen United in Anger, and if you haven't, you should definitely stop and watch that because it's on YouTube. some of what is in United in Anger is in here. This is based off of the same project where they were talking to different people in ACT UP, but this is more recently published and goes into a lot more and different things than United in Anger. United in Anger is a lot older, whereas this has come out within the past few years. So I've decided to pair that with Not Straight, Not White, Black Gay Men from the March on Washington to the AIDS Crisis. So obviously this is a lot more expansive, but in the same way that Let the Record Show talks about a lot of different experiences of people who were in this group and involved in AIDS activism, this looks at a particular niche of gay history that's often totally left out. I actually originally bought this partly because in the subtitle it mentions the AIDS epidemic, and it has been really hard to find books about Black gay men and the AIDS epidemic, which is really bizarre just because of the overwhelming number of people of color who were impacted by the AIDS epidemic. I do have some other books now, at least a couple that do talk about this that I have to read as well, but I decided to bring this particular one up because the other two don't focus exclusively on queer people, and this focuses on a little bit more than just the AIDS epidemic, so this seemed like a good pick. Continuing on, the next book that I have to recommend is Moving Politics, Emotion and ACT UP's Fight Against AIDS. So yes, another one on ACT UP, but these are different. Let the Record Show, like I said, based on lots of interviews and different things like that, and kind of gives a full, more full picture of who ACT UP was, whereas Moving Politics is more focused on the trajectory of the group. It's looking at the development of the group, but also the fracturing and the role that emotions played in this. I will say this one is definitely more on the academic end. And it's being paired with something that's also on the academic end. But this was one of the earlier books that I had read in this HIV and AIDS TBR, and I'm really glad that I did. It pulls from a lot of really cool primary sources, newspapers, and pictures that are included in here. And it really talks about the impact of Bowers v. Hardwick, which was the Supreme Court case that determined that laws against gay sex were constitutional. And this wasn't reversed until the 2000s, but it was a catalyst in turning kind of direct action activism from something that people shied away from to something that was highly favored. I'm going off on a tangent, but if you are interested in something that's maybe a little bit more academic or more challenging, but also has a lot of really good primary resources, this one is great. And I have paired this with Tangled Memories, the Vietnam War, the AIDS Epidemic, and the Politics of Remembering. I got this because I wanted to put together a class for myself surrounding memory, specifically like cultural memory, so like the way that societies remember something or what becomes the default understanding of history or of a particular event. And this is one that I found to kind of read. So in this, she's talking about the AIDS epidemic and also the Vietnam War, which the back of this say are two of the most traumatic and contested events in recent U.S. history. And it looks at memorials, films, media, and all of this to talk about cultural memory in these two really big events in the U.S. So, I expect this to be kind of similarly like academic-y, and it's also more than that, I think focuses on like a really unique perspective. Like Moving Politics is talking about emotion, as much as I just like kind of went on about other things. Ultimately they're talking about how these particular things impacted people's emotions and how those kind of propel the trajectory of things. So this one is kind of looking at similarly something niche, unique, and probably a cool and important perspective. After that, I would like to recommend Illness's Metaphor and AIDS and Its Metaphors by Susan Sontag. And these are a group of really classic, like long essays that are bound up together. Illness's Metaphor looks a lot at cancer, and a bit at tuberculosis, and looks at how these different ailments have been talked about and used symbolically in different ways. So she talks at length about tuberculosis and kind of how it's seen, and talking about things like calling something like a social cancer and kind of the implications of that, and sort of how this all translates to basically the stigma of disability. And then AIDS and Its Metaphors is a follow-up that she wrote following, or really in the middle of, like the AIDS epidemic, and talking about how AIDS is talked about in these different metaphorical ways and what that means, the kind of impact that it has. But I also have several other books looking at imagery and art in relation to AIDS and the AIDS epidemic, including Reframing Bodies, AIDS Bearing Witness in the Queer Moving Image. So this kind of uses different films around the era to talk about how filmmakers and viewers are interacting, kind of what it says, especially looking at films that were by people who had AIDS or their loved ones. And I think this is also going to be really neat to read in like relationship to Tangled Memories too, just because this also pulls a lot from different kinds of media. But anyways, that is this one. It sounds really neat. And also related to this one is The Gentrification of the Mind by Sarah Schulman. This was about the landscape of New York. I'm not sure that I want to say post-epidemic, but certainly after the peak and after a lot of people had died. And this leaves lots of apartments open, but also a lot of like space in the community. So talking about how actual gentrification happened as a result of this, because either people died and it left their apartment over, or someone died and their partner was forced out of the apartment because they weren't on the lease. That also frequently happened, which that also gave landlords the opportunity to increase the rent, and then you see gentrification. But there's also, in tandem with this, she's also talking about the art scene in New York, and talking about how with a lot of these new people coming in, because they're seeing New York as like a gay haven, there are people who are disconnected from the history, from the art, and since they're not interacting with that, they are kind of forming something different and disconnected. So in this, she does talk a lot about queer film, and I actually read this and watched. I found one of the films on Vimeo, I think, or one of the non-YouTube places, and it was really neat to watch in relationship to what she was saying in this book. And what I have paired with that is After Silence, A History of AIDS Through Its Images. So this is looking at art in the AIDS epidemic. So a lot of the different protest art. I'm gonna have to make sure there's nothing, like some of these have nudity in it and YouTube doesn't like that, but some of them are fine. And like the iconic pink triangle, which was featured on Moving Politics. So this is looking at queer art in the age of the AIDS epidemic. And then the last pairing that I have to talk about is not nonfiction, but still very relevant to queer history, in tandem with some of like the nonfiction AIDS TBR stuff, I also have some fiction stuff. So I've been reading a lot of literary fiction published in the late 80s and early 90s. And I have a lot more that I want to read. So I could be talking about many different things, but the one that I will bring up is The Gifts of the Body by Rebecca Brown. And this is written by a lesbian who is also a caretaker in the height of the AIDS epidemic. And this was written in 94, I think, which is around that peak. So things were terrible. They weren't looking up. And I think this is autofiction. You don't actually get to know the character's name, or really their gender. I think it's kind of alluded to. But the thing that made me pick this book in particular, and the thing that I love about this, is how it is able to communicate the emotion of the moment. Which isn't to say that everyone was on the same level at the same time, but what I got from this is something that I got from a lot of other books in this time period that I've read, but she distills it in such a particular way. You know, she's actively involved in community in this, but it's kind of the sort of necessary dissociation and normalization of, I guess, kind of these awful things that are happening, but also the sort of necessary disconnect, because the alternate is kind of acknowledging this really hopeless, terrible situation. So this is told in vignettes where this nurse's assistant is going to different people's houses. She's not a nurse, but she can feed them and clean them and these different things. And you get spotlights on these different people that she's seeing. And the front half of the book and the last half of the book, they're kind of mirroring chapters. But this is really incredible. So much of the way that this is written is so matter of fact. But like I said, it's that kind of disconnect that you can see on top of all of these other things that are actually happening, that I think perfectly distills part of this moment. So that's The Gifts of the Body. So to pair with that one, I have 86 by David Feinberg. David Feinberg was a gay activist with AIDS that talked a lot about his experience, and he has this book and a follow-up, and he also has a memoir. All three of those are on my TBR to read, but I'm going to start with this one. I don't know if this is autofiction, but it's certainly informed by his experiences. This one is more satirical and kind of raunchy, very pointed, talking about what it's like living through this particular historical moment. So that is what I have in terms of queer history recommendations. Like I said, this video focused more on politics and the AIDS epidemic. If you're interested in more queer history or stuff that's particular, especially to lesbian and trans history, be sure to check out part 1. If you've read any of these or are planning on it, or have anything else related to suggest, definitely mention it down in the comments. And thank you all so much for watching. Bye.